Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back to Writing What I Like, Field Notes of a Black Woman Scholar. My name is Dr. Venus Evans Winters, also known as Dr. V. And once again, I am here with Dr. Mildred Boveda, and we are talking about all things mental health, wellness, fitness, mindfulness. So we're just going there deep and we're trying to figure out how we can combine the worlds of both research and mental health and wellness. And today we have our guest with us, Raymond Adams. And Dr. Boveda, tell them a little bit more about our series here on Writing What I Like, Field Notes of the Black Women Scholars. What is this special series?
Yes, and I'm honored to be part of this special series. It's called Beyond the Soundbite, Black Feminist Research and Wellness. And we are so excited that you have joined us. And yeah, I just am excited to talk to you about the work that you've been doing, especially regarding men's health. And there are a lot of implications
So,
between,
and I have the, well, you're introducing. So,
yes,
because we do this every episode. So, do you prefer Dr. Raymond Adams,
oh
Professor
yeah,
Raymond Adams, or my mama said to call me? What's your preference,
Oh,
Raymond?
Dr. Adams is fine. That's fine.
Okay, Dr. Adams, I like it. It has a ring to it. And
Yeah.
Dr.
so,
Adams.
Dr. Adams. So, Dr. Adams, can you introduce yourself to our audience? And I should let you know we are on both YouTube and a podcast. So, we have some people who may be driving,
And
walking,
listening.
running, listening, while we have other people who may have visuals.
Okay. Um, well, I'm Dr. Raymond Adams. I have been working in higher education since 2014, and currently I'm an associate professor at Morgan State University School of Social Work. My background has is in public health social work. I primarily focus in on the intersections between prostate cancer survivorship, mental health, and spirituality among older African and African American men who live in rural areas. And one of the things that I've been doing in my research is gaining more knowledge behind the epidemiological factors that impact their overall well-being. So, in order for me to have a better understanding of that, I went back to school a couple years ago and got a master's in epidemiology. So, I
Wow, I didn't even know that.
I use that knowledge now to add critical factors such as the importance of looking at incidence rates, prevalence, and the way in which we examine Black cancer epidemiology. And so that's what I primarily do. So now that I'm at Morgan State University, I'm hoping to use the institutional resources and some of the sponsorships that they've been getting from their external funders to support my research in doing research around Black cancer epidemiology among men. My second research agenda is looking at Black maternal epidemiology. So one of the things that caught my attention when I was doing my master's in epidemiology is looking at the high rate of Black women dying from preeclampsia. And
Mm,
that was really odd to me, simply because of the way in which it's treatable, much like if caught early, it's very treatable like prostate cancer, but a lot of Black women unfortunately die from gestational diabetes and things like that. It's something that could, if caught early, it could be treated with medicine and behavioral interventions.
Okay,
Um,
so Raymond, I like receipts. No, I'm just kidding. So Raymond, before because you sound really smart, right? And I'm in the social sciences as well as a clinical social worker, and you are in public health social work. So we have some familiarity with the coursework. What is your bachelor's in for our audience?
So I have a bachelor's in psychology, a master's in social work, a master's in epidemiology, and my PhD is in social work.
Go ahead, black man. Okay, I just had to get that out. I had to get that out. Okay. Okay. So Mildred, when Mildred and I were in conversation, Dr. Adams, um, Mildred said, hey, V, we should, title this or call this, we played around with some words, beyond the soundbite, Black feminist research and wellness. And I remember thinking, writing what I like. Now everybody know that's Stephen Biko. Writing what I like, field notes of a Black woman scholar. It was going to center more on like my pedagogy, how I think about research and writing and wellness and health, and really taking it back to the community, thinking about how do we get our research out of the hands of the few and behind, paywalls and back into our communities, right? Like griots. And so Mildred, again, Black feminist research. And I was thinking, that is what we do, right? We take our research and our teachings, our pedagogy out into the community or in collaboration with the community, or I like to say the community feeds me, right? We eating off the same plate if I can help it. Raymond, what do you think about this idea of Black feminist research? And then I'll let Mildred also like talk about what are we thinking when we talk about Black feminist research and wellness?
So when I think, when I hear the term Black feminism, I always think about the way in which it's conceptualized and the way that it's understood. Oftentimes, the way that it was conceptualized is not translated to the way it's understood in the general populace. But for me, I just see Black feminism as a term that it equates to achieving liberation and equity for all individuals, regardless of their race, gender, and social location. And so when we think of wellness, that includes both the mind, the body, and the spirit. So there's a holistic approach to how Black feminism equates to well-being that resonates for me, if that makes sense.
It's a codification, right? I think that idea, the term Black feminism, I think it's a codification of histories, of memories, of, I'm going to say, centuries of organizing Black women's thoughts, art movements, right? As well as a set of practices. Mildred, what does it mean for you?
Yeah, I think what Dr. Adams just said really, really is the way I understand Dr. Adams. I've known him for several years, and I've always noted the respectful way that you've engaged many Black women in our field. But yeah, a lot of people think Black feminism is about women, Black women only advocating for themselves. That is a misunderstanding. At least the Black feminist thoughts and the Black feminists and Black feminisms, as you like to write, Dr. V, that I engage in are about the collective well-being of everyone, coalition building, understanding the interconnectedness between our wellness, understanding the intersectionality of us being whole, fully human, beyond human. Yes, and so that's what it means to me, and that's why it was very brilliant and very on point to have the perspective of Dr. Adams here, because we as Black feminists, we care about the well-being of everyone. So that's my thought about that.
Yeah, so yeah, very well stated. Raymond, I should tell you, we were talking about you behind your back. And we were coming up with a list of people because we only have so much bandwidth, so much capacity, especially now. We all were hit really, really hard post-election results and definitely mid-January, and we've been getting hit. And so we had a short list of people whom we really wanted to be in conversation with early on. And I think you made my top list. And it was interesting. And beyond gender politics, I was just like, I need Raymond Adams. And I explained your research, but also Raymond, and I think this is important for it to be stated, to our listening audience, students, policymakers, writers, people who are like all of us are in the process of healing. I was thinking I wanted Raymond because Raymond, you and I, even though we haven't met too long in person, right? We spent some time in person, I think at least once. A couple of conversations, a couple other at least one other podcast episode during the pandemic. And Raymond, what stood out to me is I may not see you out there on social media, say running marathons or posting pictures of your healthy food choices, but you've always engaged me, and I'm just speaking for myself, but I'm sure others would agree. You've certainly engaged me in what I thought was meaningful and thoughtful cultural
Mm,
and spiritual conversations. And I
yeah.
do think that culture and spirituality is a part of our health, should be a part of our health conversations, is not in the West, is not. And you and I both know that from a clinical perspective, and all of us know that from an educational perspective. But can you talk about how do you center culture and spirituality in your research and your teaching, or how you even do public pedagogy? Because I do consider you a public pedagogue.
So for me, it all began at my in my doctoral program. Just for the listeners, like where I finished my doctorate is not where I began my doctorate. So when I started out in higher education, I was at an institution that will remain nameless, that did not support my Black-centered research agenda. And it wasn't until I went to my alumnus, which is Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi, go Tigers, I was able to cultivate my full self in my dissertation. So
Mm, mm,
I always knew that we, as members of the African diaspora, we resonated well with spirituality. It's a part of our genetic makeup, if not our disposition, and it informs our decision making. So I knew that whenever I began my dissertation research, that had to be at the center of what I wrote. So as I'm writing and talking about black men's health, I came across my research and I saw how it was subsumed within the scope of larger population studies, whether it was a retrospective study
mm,
or or a prospective study. All of the research did not home in on what does prostate cancer look like for Black men. The
mm,
statistics were in the overall instancy and prevalency rate of the study, but what does it look like for us? And what I mean by that is, what does it look like when we don't have transportation to get to MD Anderson? What does it look like when you are stage 4 and you're getting ready to transition and you're worried about who's going to take care of my wife, who's going to take care of my son? What if the
mm,
life insurance policy doesn't come through? Those things are not in the body of research articles. Is just say that 1 in 4 Black men die from prostate cancer at a late stage of diagnosis, but not
mm,
the in between. So where I factor in my research and teaching is that you take the whole person. It's kind of like the way in which George Engels' biopsychosocial perspective includes that spirituality. So the research supports that people who are church affiliated or who engage in their spiritual thought, they speak to their transitional beings or
mm,
their chosen uh, religious affiliation before they do anything health wise. And that's no different than what the Garoots did, in before pre-colonial stage. We spoke to our ancestors first before we made any decision about war, politics, or family decisions. And
mm,
so that just doesn't disappear simply because, we live
mm,
in the United States of America. That's just an
Mm.
ingrained genetic predisposition for us to have to speak to someone above us.
mm,
The way I speak to students at all levels, whether they're master's, bachelor's, or doctoral level students, is that social work is not apolitical. That's one. And then two, you can't forget social location, gender, and race, because all those factors help determine the whole person. When you excise one, you're not respecting the whole person. And I pray I answered your question right.
You did, and I'm curious, Raymond, for you, who who enculturated you or introduced you to this idea of spirituality? Because I separate spirituality from religion. I use a
Mhm.
basic sociological definition for religion. That's a set of practices or rituals that's usually done in community. Right, say going to church, which we know African Americans are the most religious people in the United States. Going to church, praying, reading the Bible. I separate that from spirituality. So for you,
I do as
when
well.
did you start thinking about spirituality? Like where did that come from? Where did, Mildred too, I want to hear your thoughts, but Raymond, where does that come from?
So I think because of my lived experience, I was already acculturated to spirituality and religion. So I grew up Sunni, and then I got acculturated to Southern Baptist because of my
Wow.
mother. So I knew that, God for me was in everything, and the way in which we conceptualize religiosity and spirituality, and that was the clear distinction that I made in my dissertation. The same thing that you said, spirituality is a set of spiritual practices, and religiosity is kind of like the dogma that informs those spiritual
Mhm.
practices. And so that's the distinction that I always have had. And anytime I engage individuals across the religious spectrum, I've worked with people who practice Wicca. I've met people who practice atheism. I've met people, I met the Quakers. When I did my fellowship in Westchester, and I've never ever went on into their community. And when I saw that they were having church in their house, I was like, oh wow, that's new. And I'm still learning,
Wow.
there are certain religious groups that have different foundational buildings, right? Some operate on the Old Testament, some just acknowledge the new. So same with people of the Islamic faith. So, but I saw that to say my understanding of religiosity and spirituality had to be distinct and clear, because when we talk about African spirituality, that has
Yes.
to be denoted in the research too, that there are different forms of spirituality that people in the African diaspora practice. So
As you said,
what,
you grew up practicing Sunni, and I just
yeah,
yeah. Mhm,
yeah.
mhm,
So
mhm.
that's the religious dogma, right? So, the way I pray, the way I engage prayer, the way that is central to my overall being, that never changed for me. And it still hasn't. I still get up before the crows, cluck, or the roosters cluck, and I pray. I get on all fours and I just start praying, and I still think about how my day is going to begin, and who's going to guide my steps. And I ask the Lord to always guide my steps and everything I say. Just as I said the same thing before I got on here. I said, just guide me to say the right words, and say them in a way that is going to be, absorbed for people.
What,
So
when you
in
say
short,
Sunni, what do you mean by Sunni?
so they're different sects of Islam.
Islamic.
There's Sunni Muslims, there's Sufi, um, and there are other denominations built down from that. And
Mhm.
so the Wolof people of Senegal, that's the largest. What the Wolof people are the largest Muslim African tribe in Sunni, not Sunni, but in Senegal. And so that,
Were you born in Senegal?
yes, yes.
Mm.
Mhm.
So I started understanding from there. I understood how religiosity and spirituality related relates to my overall well-being. And then when I came and I saw how it looked in the Judeo-Christian religion, there were similarities, but there were still differences, but there were similarities, and so that's why my dissertation was 8 chapters, wasn't to try to show off, is because I had to make those distinctions.
Yeah.
Whenever I engaged the men and when I interviewed the men, I had to know their Judeo-Christian religion, because I interviewed predominantly African and African American men. I need to know their family construct, their cultural background, so that as a part of my data analysis, I got the whole person. And so once I saw the whole person, I was able to make inferences and conclusions to what my research disclosed. And that basically is the way I understand how I engage research. I take theory, research, and practice and meet them at all those intersections in order to come out with a well-informed decision about the
Mhm.
people that I enact inquiry with, right?
And it sounds like
Well,
research, theory, practice,
Mhm.
spirituality.
Hmm.
Right, and probably and culture for you for sure.
Yeah.
Mildred,
How old were you when,
where
how, I was going to ask Dr. Adams, how old were you when you came to the United States?
12.
12. And then so you mentioned that when you came to the United States, you also started adapting your mom's faith a little bit more.
Yes.
And you mentioned a lot of southern states. I also grew up in Florida. I think geography is when we talk about positionality, which is what we're kind of getting into right now, is our positionalities as researchers, and how there's a tradition that wants to ignore that
I think
positionality.
that's funny, Mildred.
Yeah.
Sorry. So to the audience, I have a cold, so I'm not trying to be a diva and drink like, a whole bottle of water right in front of everybody. But my throat's starting to itch. But Mildred, I think that was really interesting because you said positionality. So you see how we take up the discourse of the academy and thinking about it through Dr. Raymond, Dr. Adams, Raymond's work, he was situating community, so we can leave behind so many people just by our words. But I just wanted to clarify, even, I got younger, young
Yeah.
people who listen, but even the idea of because I think Raymond probably would rephrase it or could rephrase it from positionality statement, positionality and Mildred, you can, operationalize, define positionality. But like, I feel like Raymond was talking more about how he bring his personhood to his research, his
Yeah.
cultural awareness, his overall, yeah, right,
Absolutely.
right. So we even our words they have meaning to us because we grew up in this business, right? I know I have been an academia since I was 3, so
Well,
sometimes we
positionality
can.
is not something that everybody in research even wants to talk about. In fact, traditionally, people have tried to ignore how positionality, your personhood, how geography, and that's where I was going with my
And
question.
Raymond says social location.
Social location, your situatedness. There's a lot of different words, but really it's about geography and how geography, and the word geography, a lot of us when we're in school, we're thinking about geography in terms of like what country, right? But positionality, whatever term you're using, this idea that you are located somewhere and how your location can shape the way you're thinking, the way you're processing things, the way you're engaging. And so going from Senegal to the South, right? And me personally, I grew up in Florida, in South Florida, where it's the South, but it's also the Caribbean, right? And all of those intersections, right, of locations, especially when it comes to when you mentioned earlier the African diaspora. Growing up in the South, I saw two versions of Black spirituality, or not two. It was far more than two. We have a tendency to kind of reduce things to dualities, but I did notice that when I would engage some of my friends who were really, really engaged in the Black Baptist or Black American kind of church traditions, there was a lot of demonizing of other spiritual practices that were Afro descendant or were African based. Whereas when I grew up with a very churchy mom, my mom was very churchy, very Christian, very very Caribbean, very Dominican. I also knew that before she converted, she had a mixture of both African and indigenous practices, and she always credited her father, who practices these African and indigenous practice, as the person who taught her spirituality, taught her how to love God, taught her how to love the divine. She never demonized it, right? And I remember in Florida feeling that tension of like, well, mommy's not over here demonizing these non-Christian practices. In fact, she says a man who doesn't even, her father, who doesn't even practice the Christian, like you mentioned earlier, doctrines, dogmas, traditions that we are, was a man who brought her to God. And yet, for some of my friends who were, really entrenched in the Black church, at least the Black American experience, I would hear a lot of like harsh statements about my friends who practice, other faiths. Did you see that tension at all in your work in terms of talking about Black men's spirituality and their relationship to wellness in the South, and what you engaged in when you were in
Mhm.
in synagogue. Did you see that kind of
Yes.
duality and
Yeah.
tension?
Yeah. So like I saw it over time as I grew up. I saw the way in which, Judeo-Christians responded to anything that was outside of their comfort with it's not evangelical Christianity because there's a distinction even with that, but just
Yeah.
with Christianity. And so one of the things that I've always tried, and this is what I carry over to students, you will not always work with black and white people, and you will not always work with Christians, and you will not always work with women. You will not always work with just men. You have to
Okay.
understand that there's diaspora on an ethnic and racial level, but there's diaspora in thought in the way that people experience the world. And so in my upbringing, I was um, I was always innately aware of superstition because in my culture, we believe in the power of spells. There's still people who practice, their branch of their indigenous faith, and that comes with different triggers for certain groups in my tribe. So like we oftentimes I still wear like charms, or I still wear things that protect me. Even though I'm a Christian now, I still wear them. And I'm very superstitious. I throw salt over my back. If someone sweeps my feet, I spit on the broom. If so. And those are the things that I still do,
It's amazing how sometimes people are dismissive of those things, of those knowledges, and they say it's superstition. They'll say sexist things like old wives' tale as if there's something wrong. But there's a knowledge there, right? There's something beautiful in those practices that were passed on, and we could probably trace it, maybe we can't, but the word superstition tends to be a dismissive term. But to me, I think I respect a lot of those kinds of, I don't know what's a better word. Maybe Dr. V, you know a better word than superstitious practices, but other kind of spiritual based practices that we have. Yeah, they could be really
Yeah.
powerful.
Yeah, rituals.
So
But
Rituals.
yeah, rituals and beliefs. But I was thinking too, Raymond and Mildred, how do, especially people who are part of the diaspora, right? And African people, Raymond, I was just thinking, you're telling your students that you're going to come across many people of different races, genders, ethnicities, nationalities, languages, etc. But you know what I was thinking too, I always tell students, y'all do know the majority of Black people now in America are actually not descendants of the Southern uh, African experience. Majority of people now, Black people now in the United States are actually probably of direct African lineage, meaning first generation, second generation from the continent of Africa to migrate here to the United States. I think that still hold true. So I think that's interesting. So how is there a distinction, or how do you all distinguish from
Yes.
what's Black American, what's Southern Black American, what's African, what's African American? Y'all understand? Like some of these lines are so blurred. I'm like, wait, we did that growing up. Or wait, I know for sure my mother and them did that. I know for sure my
Yes.
grandparents did that. But it's also African. And then I'm curious as students of culture, race, and religion, is there a distinction? Should there be a distinction? Or should we be naming these traditions as a part of our indigenous, knowledges, memories?
I mean, I totally respect those faiths and those practices and those rituals. And um, I'm very cautious and I'm very averse. In fact, one of the things that probably attracted me to you, Dr. V, is exactly what I was just sharing with Dr. Adams, how there are some times, and listen, children can be cruel and children are children, and children reflect what adults are saying around them, and also they reflect what's in the media and what's in the curriculum. When I went to school in Miami, Florida, there were two really, really problematic things. I went to predominantly Black schools with predominantly Black teachers. And two phrases that were used in order to other and to bully Black children were, by Black children, were HBO, which was a Haitian body order, right? Which was super derogatory, like anti Haitianism, extreme, right? Extreme. right? And then the other thing was African booty scratcher, right? And these are childish things that I remember, and like what I mentioned earlier was softer compared to these kind of childish, kind of hurtful comments, which was, and it's not softer. It's actually really hurtful when you demonize people's indigenous practices and you make it out to be something evil. When, like I said, in the case of my mother, she acknowledges still, like till the end of her life, that this man who practiced this mixture of African and indigenous and also Catholic practices was the one who brought her to God, even though she was practicing more traditional, more palatable versions of Christianities. So when I was a little girl, I was very churchy, and most of my teachers were African American women, even though the students in my school systems came from a bunch of different cultures. Like I said, we had Haitians, we had some students whose parents were African, Nigerian, we had some children who were Bahamian, Jamaican, and then we also had African Americans from the South, right? And I remember I was liked. Number one, I was liked for a couple of things, and we haven't talked about colorism yet in our explicitly in our podcast, but colorism was definitely like in the house, right? Like definitely, and also just because I was really churchy, I was really Christian. I was really, I came to church, I came to school with my Bible. Like I would talk about Wednesday Bible school, and kids who
You
weren't.
came to school with your Bible,
Oh
Mildred.
man, I was Mildred, right? My name was Mildred, and I was like Sister Mildred. And my black teachers loved me because I was the right kind of little black girl, right? Like, you know, and because that's, I mean, and then the little kids whose either parents weren't as engaged with the church, right? That maybe their parents were dealers, right? Maybe their parents were just young, and doing the best that they can, and they weren't as churchy. Those kids went through it. Those kids went through it. I remember seeing I remember a little boy specifically in one of my classes, who had his hair in locks, right? And small locks. It was small, it was beginning, and just the disparaging comments that were made about that, right? It's not just religion or it's not just spiritual practices, but it's also class. It was also colorism, right? It was super intersectional. And so
I think that the people who are are closest, if there was a spectrum, the people whom are the closest to African are is what you're talking about. Those are the most likely to be stereotyped,
it was
to be
horrible.
discriminated against, to be, real, just it's hate, right? Hatred, right?
Self-hatred.
But
It's
so
self-hatred.
you reminded me, you were saying something about, oh, something you were saying, but Raymond, it brought me back to, prostate cancer, medical conditions in the Black community. And Mildred, sorry, I was having a moment, but you said
No, no.
something. There was a connection there. So, oh, I know what it was. You were talking about religion and spirituality. Now,
Yeah.
Raymond, from what I understand about your research, there is a component embedded in the research that found that these Black men, or the Black community, or the people who were helping take care of these Black men, almost relied more on religion and their spiritual beliefs than they did mainstream medical technology or diagnoses. Could you explain that? And how, like, where do we meet that medium, for Black people, for Black men in particular, and those of us who care for them?
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Great
one of the
question.
things that I've found is that there's oftentimes poor patient doctor-patient communication,
Mm,
and then there's also a lack of literacy, and then there's also a lack of knowledge and a
mm,
lack of access. All these things compound, late stage diagnosis among Black men. And
mm.
Mhm.
so, but for me and for what I've
Can
read,
I repeat that, Raymond?
yeah,
So what I heard you say is that lack of communication between doctor patient, lack
yes,
of literacy. You didn't clarify, but I'm assuming cultural literacy, but it could be literacy on the part of the Black community too,
yes,
medical literacy.
Mm,
That it all contributes to late stage diagnoses. Ding, ding,
yes.
ding, because that's what I'm learning too from the media. It's not that prostate cancer itself kills Black men at higher rates, and you can explain that, okay? But that late diagnosis or the lack of early screening. is partially due to some of these things you named, right?
Yes. In the retrospective studies, prospective studies, and population health studies support these facts. And so one of the things what I try to do in my research is determine how and what extent do those variables inform their overall well-being. So when you sit down and you deal with older men, right, who are seasoned, and when you're seasoned, you're seasoned in the way in which you think, in the way that you will behave. So there's no movability behind that. What I've found to be helpful is if they're partnered. When they're partnered, they're able to stop being restrictive and being a little bit open simply because they don't want to engage in those battles with their partner. So,
The thing is though, Raymond, right?
yeah,
Oh wow, that's really good. But what's interesting is is it true in your research too, the majority of Black people are not going to be married or in a formal legal marriage. In your data, I mean, in your research, did you find based off the data that most of these Black men were partnered, even if they weren't married, they was living with a spouse
yeah,
or a partner, whatever, girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever. Is that what you found in your
yes,
research?
yeah.
Okay.
As what I found, and it's actually helpful because when they're partnered, they are more apt to go to the doctor with them, and so that they can hear the narrative of what needs to occur in order to allow for them to have a quality life outcome. Because it's not just them making a well-informed decision for themselves, but they're making one for the family dyad. And so this is one of the things that me and Dr. Owens at the University of South Carolina are going to write about, because he already has the data, and all we just need to bring it out. And we're going to use Black feminist thought to bring this out to the forefront,
I
because
love to hear
again,
that, Raymond. That's good.
that's where when I deal with Black men who have Black women beside them,
Mm.
they're often told, and you often see that they respond more readily to initial screening, continued follow-up treatment, and engagement with their healthcare because they have that partner that's walking beside them so that they can live for the family diet and also live for each other. And so,
Mm. Beautiful.
um, for clarity, I think it's important that that I break down the stages because our current president stated that there are 9 stages to cancer and they're not.
Mm.
So
Oh, Raymond, before you break it
yeah,
down, okay, because I like to provide some type of like data, research information too. Thank you. So don't forget, you're gonna break it down. But Raymond, here's the other reason why I needed you on like now, right? If I had it my way, to have been last week, but with Mildred's travel and research, and she be getting that grant money. But anyway, I'm telling all her business, y'all. So, but Raymond, I needed you here, Dr. Raymond Adams. Okay, because recently, past President Biden was diagnosed with prostate cancer and it went public, right? And I mean, people were giving him well wishes. People were, they damn near prescribed him to death. And I'm like, y'all, they didn't say he was dying, right? So I thought about your research.
mm,
But two, of course, some people were less compassionate and was saying that, he was covering up information and what would have happened if he's gotten diagnosis. But I think for the most part, majority of Americans were very sensitive to the diagnosis and what this meant to his family. Now, just to pose that to last year around this time, Secretary of Defense under Biden, who was a Black man, a dark-skinned Black man, an unapologetic Black man who fits the demographics of your research, by the way. He was certainly over the age of 55.
He was 70
You know,
years old when
70 years old. Okay. So fits your profile. Maybe not low income from the South, but definitely age wise, demographically speaking, and race, ethnicity, etc. And his name is Lloyd Austin, if I'm correct. Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense. I will tell you, Raymond and Mildred, they demonized that man. They damn near criminalized him and was asking for his head. They almost wanted him arrested and ousted out of the White House, at least. That's my exaggeration. They at least wanted him out the White House, and it was a soundbite in the news. And it felt like he was being humiliated and shamed. And when I looked at his face, Raymond, I thought about your research. Because you can see, one, I don't know what the procedures or treatment is like, but you can see when he was on that microphone in front of those cameras, that man just looked fatigued. He looked tired. I was thinking, is he gonna pass out? But you can see it was humiliation. If you've ever spent any time with a Black man who has any type of dignity, I felt like they was robbing that man of his dignity, not just his privacy. I understand the rules of law, I understand policy, especially, et cetera, when you're on the public's dime. But they treated him as, they gave no compassion in the moment. There was no, we wish you, well wishes and sympathy. Here's your flowers, your bouquets. We're going to light one up for your family. It was more like, get his ass out of there while he's going through this trying moment. But Raymond, I thought about your research in the sense that, one, this is a cultural conversation for this brother. Two, it's based off your research, this is typical of an older Black man or any Black man to kind of cover up this type of diagnosis. Because let's be honest, Mildred, I hope I don't get in trouble afterwards. She's like, Venus, did you say that live? But Raymond, let's have real conversations. When do we talk about Black men's penises? When do we talk about Black men's overall reproductive health in this country and not it being sexualized or from the perspective of an athlete? So could you walk us through these stages and let us know? Because I just wanted to put this in cultural language and from a cultural perspective.
Yes. So
Powerful comparison, by the way, Dr. V. Powerful contrast to see how when our president, and because there was other things that it took him a while to talk about many other health conditions, right? Right, and how the grace that he was shown by the American public when it took him a while to come out and talk about health conditions, and then the vilifying and demonizing of a Black man who was dealing with not only his health and his prognosis with his prostate cancer, but also serving the American public.
Vilifying and demonizing, great word
What
choice.
an incredible contrast. And I definitely want to hear, yes, I'm grateful to be part of this conversation, Dr. Adams.
yes. So when we look at the example of the former defense secretary, Mr. Allen, we have to look at the stage in which he's getting his treatment. So he did it the right way, and he got the initial treatment, and they were able to remove any type of polyps that could have advanced into the second, third, fourth stage. So I think the part of where they took that soundbite to justify how he was trying to hide his diagnosis so that he can occupy his current position, it is, I thought it was distasteful. So oftentimes
Well,
when
too.
Black men have any type of comorbid disorder or any type of disorder, it's a point of making sure that they're perceived in the world at large as whole and strong. And in that perception, they put themselves at a disadvantage and also at risk of mortality due to that believed need to be whole and strong. And so I go back to that point where I was talking about if they're partnered, it gives them an opportunity to be reflective in their own self-awareness. Um, I can't suffer in silence because I have people dependent on me. Um, I cannot continue to operate in this capacity. If it progresses, I might not be able to perform whatever task that I need to have. So in the community work that I did recently here at Morgan with the Center for Urban Health Equity, we did something about Black men's health in relation to maternal health. But in my discussions with them, I talked about why it's important for you to be open and honest with not only yourself, but for people who are there to meet your need. Um, so when you're diagnosed in stage one, there are tests that can be administered to you. So there are two tests. The first test is called the prostate antigen specific antigen test. And
Mm.
so that's where they will take a sample of your blood, not your blood, blood, but blood, and they will determine your levels in your blood to determine if you have the antigen for prostate cancer. And there's different gauges and different levels, and that's where the doctor will recommend that either you, and there are different types of procedures and different treatments. Some, in my experience, oftentimes do radical prostatectomies, and that's where they remove the prostate gland um, out. So, but even if they remove your prostate gland out, depending on the level of metastasis, and what I mean by that is the level in which your abnormal cells have generated on that, and which is the cancer, they will recommend a radical prostatectomy. And it's just the one-shot procedure where they remove it. But then this goes to the point to where Dr. V talks about penises and erections and things like that. Oftentimes, a lot of men don't do that because they don't want to lose that ability to maintain an erection. And this is where the
Mm.
relationship factor comes in of being whole and strong and representing yourself as a man. But this also comes into the point I made earlier about literacy. While that may be a factor, but there are also ways to, compensate for that, but that was a conversation that you have with your primary care physician and talk to them about, this needs to occur, but this will also occur as well. But we have another form of treatment for that. Um, I remember in my conversation with one of my older dissertation participants. He told me he had to go in and get a shot in his penis in order for him to have that. And it was easier for him to have a male in the room than have a woman administer it because again, he's modest and he would rather have his wife in there with him than her, a young woman in her 20s and 30s doing that in that sensitive area, which is understandable. But this is where the literacy comes into play, right? If you don't know that there's a possibility for something, you have to ask the people around you what is possible. So that's stage one. The second stage is where it's metastasized, right? There's still treatment options so that recurrence doesn't occur, and that's stage three. Um, there's still treatment options for stage two. So they will either do the radical prostatectomy, or they will do medications, or they will introduce you to other type of treatment modalities when it's in either stage two or three. But the last and final stage is stage four. That's where it's advanced, and that's where we begin to prepare for end of life care because it's spread from the prostate gland to other parts of your body, either to the bone or to other major organs. And that's where no other treatment modalities can be offered, only just provided for comfort. And I want to say is that while, for example, one of the treatment approaches, which is a radical prostatectomy, while the cancerous prostate gland has been removed, you have to think about, imagine the prostate gland as an onion, okay? And the onion is above the ground, but there's a bed around the onion when you pull it. So when you pull it out, you still have little onions there. So while the cancerous part is completely out, the cancer in the bed can still be there. So that doesn't solve the problem, but it provides a solution to the overall problem. So over time, you continue having it monitored. If you see more, or if it's determined that your levels are high again, the doctor will offer another intervention. But it's important that you get screened at the first stage. And so that's where there's the lack of explanation into stage one. What is stage one? What is stage two? What is stage three? And what's stage four?
Yeah,
And
and
it's
you
just
said that
like,
the president, or I'm sorry, you said that the
yeah,
former president said, or the
the current.
president Biden
Yeah.
said that there were nine. Do you think that was just a mistake, or?
Um, I want to be gentle with what I say about our
Yeah,
president.
yeah, yeah.
I don't think that it was a mistake. I think that is also that's a mixture of both social ignorance and lack of knowledge about the ways in which cell malignancy happens in the human body. Because we have to keep in mind that he talked about a laser being shot into a person to get rid of COVID-19, and that's not how
Oh,
diseases
jeez.
work.
No,
So
thank you for clarifying. And
yeah,
I saw how important it was for you to clarify that, that it's not 9 stages, that it's 4 stages.
yeah,
And I do remember Biden saying in an interview, right, Raymond, that his cancer has not spread to the bone,
yeah,
so he was hopeful.
yeah,
So
and
that okay. So your
so
imagery,
that's that.
the stages help and the imagery help me understand now what's meant by that.
I have
And so
I have a question. I have a question about the spirituality part. I find that sometimes Black people's religiosity, there,
Yeah.
that's the word, right? That was an
Mhm.
English language learner moment. My first language was Spanish, and it just snuck out right there. But sometimes it's this idea that Black people, you know, will pray away their problems is
Mm.
stated in a way that I find to be very anti-Black. Sometimes is the way I receive it, because I loved it earlier when you were talking about how it is in our DNA. Well, first of all, the contrasting between religion and spirituality, right? But it is in our DNA to be spiritual. It is part of our core, and sometimes when I think there's an emphasis on how important it is for Black people to turn to religious leaders, spiritual leaders, in situations like this. Sometimes I think it's phrased in a way of saying that we don't believe in science, right? And is that just my impression? Is there a way to kind of counter that, or to be like, yes, science matters, but this also, any insights between either one of you in terms of how to like combat that? Because it feels very much trying to say to me, I receive it as these people are backwards, right? These people don't, and I don't agree with that.
I'll
so
let
one of
Raymond respond first, and then I have a perspective on that too, Raymond.
Awesome.
so one of the things that the literature also supports is that spirituality for members of the African diaspora is a protective factor. Um, and that speaks to your point to why they say we can pray this sickness away. Um, I don't trust modern medicine. I've always trusted God. And
Mm,
so the literature is replicant with that statement. And where I feel like we step in as people who are, scholar community practitioners, is where we meet them where they are. And I learned this during my training at Baylor. You have to meet people where they are. And once you meet people where they are, you can help have them meet at least a middle ground. So one of the things that I'm hoping to do if I get more, if the federal funding comes through, is to do what I did during my practice, is like gender-based church interventions, specifically for
mm,
men. So men listen to other men. That's that's point blank. And that's the reason why a lot of the men that I've engaged who have prostate cancer are still alive today, because they engaged other men in those safe spaces. So you have the Alderman Board, you have men's groups that occur within those institutions, religious institutions. And because they occurred in those religious institutions in the safe space and gendered specific environments, they were able to be real about, well, yes, God teaches us to pray. Romans 8:28 teaches us that all things work together for the good of those who love and serve the Lord and are called according to his purpose. And when you use scripture in that way and undergird with research, it supports the narrative that is already ingrained in their soul. So
mm. And in
so
their soul.
yeah, so when you meet people at those intersections, you're
Yes.
able to tell them that yes, you can continue to pray, but continue to pray as you get treatment. And once you see that you can still meet God where He is, and you still can meet man where they are, in helping you maintain your whole strong self, then that dispels the the over religiosity that oftentimes keeps us from living healthy and happy lives as we matriculate towards the other
Yeah,
side.
and I guess I'm sensitive. I'm in the field of special education. I see it a lot where people are like, again, like being dismissive of families of color who mistrust the special education process, the medical model, and like kind of like dismiss their intelligence, or something. And it's like actually that's very informed because I love the fact that there are professionals like you two, experts, medical and well-trained clinicians, and so on like you. But historically, Western medicine has been hurtful, right? So to dismiss the mistrust of the medical system and Black people's commitment to their spiritual practices comes off to me as super anti-Black, even as somebody who is fully engaged in this higher ed process. I would love to hear your take on it, Dr. Veen, because you live it, you live this.
Yeah, I think I wanted to just add everything Raymond said, but add to it. So to provide like this historical and social cultural context. One, historically, social work has always honored different cultural and religious practices, especially for immigrant people, but or ethnic people, immigrant people, but also for Black people. It's a history there.
Beautiful. I didn't
The
know
history, yeah, I'm not saying that it's been a perfect history,
that.
that's why Raymond is in that program, that department, which, is problematic too. But historically, social work has honored. They would bring in people like Raymond or myself, for me, school social work, for Raymond, public policy, public health, or even medical social workers to say, no, we will respect their religion. That
Excellent.
does not happen in education. We have social work could certainly inform education. That's why I always say we have a code of ethics in social work. We don't have a code of ethics in education, right? From a policy perspective, I always start with that. Second, Mildred, and to those who are listening, and Raymond, I know you know this, in many parts of Africa, but certainly in indigenous African spirituality, science is not separated
Right.
from religion.
Right.
Again, it's the codification. Religion is the codification of sciences and theories and beliefs,
Mhm.
right? So I think that separation again of the scientific from the spiritual is from an African paradigm. We can't do it. It's similar with gender. It's like something ain't connecting. We just try to in our language, the English language. That's why I laughed when you said, "Oh, my Spanish tongue is defining me." No, it's not. Right? But your ELL, right? English language learning. No, no, no,
Yeah.
no. That was that your spirit was coming through.
Mm.
Yeah,
That's
it's
deep.
not. It's not. It's hard for us because English is a very limited language. I even
Mm.
heard Raymond when he was saying blood, bruh. That was his different
Mm.
languages. His mind is trying to make sense. In this world, we speak differently. This here. Uh,
Yeah.
but thirdly,
Language.
I was gonna say too. Um, this speaks to the importance, Raymond. You are again. We have these unicorns before us. This reminds me of the conversation, Mildred, we were having last week with Dr. E, the Erica, and that keep in mind, many of us forgot why we went into higher ed to begin with.
Mm.
We were blinded and distracted by the smoke and mirrors. We were blinded and
The
distracted by
prestige.
the so-called prestige and perceived status, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Years.
What happens if we remember that we went into, you went into special education to protect the most vulnerable students in educational spaces? If, Raymond forgot, oh my gosh, I'm a Black man of African ancestry in the South who get to go into Black churches and talk about this real serious health. I read your research, Raymond. He called it a epidemic. This real health epidemic in the Black community that's ignored. The number one killer. Everybody want to pivot to homicide. But what happened when we found out that this is a part of Black men's reproductive health? And I was thinking too, Raymond, and I'm gonna because I'm gonna start wrapping up what Mildred said. where does toxic masculinity, is this a toxic masculinity conversation, or is this really a gendered and cultural conversation? Or like, am I going too far when I say, let me translate into my mother's tongue? These brothers just don't want to talk about, again, we gotta be careful because we are, these men just don't want to talk about like they're ding dings. And this, it is hurting their mothers, their partners, their I would say their children, because even the boys need to know what's going on. So where is this toxic masculinity where men's entire identities is tied to their their physical anatomy and their sexual performances, um as opposed to, this is a part of my biological makeup, physiological makeup, and I need to be having this conversation with the men and the women around me.
So the thing where I spoke about earlier about the different type of tests that can be done to
I like
determine.
the way you pivoted for me saying ding ding. Thank you. So mature of you.
The way that you can be assessed for prostate cancer, there are two ways. The one where I spoke earlier is the prostate specific antigen test, and that's just getting them to just withdraw some blood from you to measure the prostate antigen in your blood. The second test is called the digital rectal exam. This is where you go into an office with your primary care doctor. They put a glove on their hand and they use their two index fingers, and then they insert it up your rectum to see how enlarged your prostate gland is, because that's where it's located. And it takes less than 2 or 3 minutes. They do have to feel around just to make sure that the gland is the right size that it should be for your age. Because again, while the American the United States Task Force for Preventative Services needs to be mentioned in this podcast, because I want people to know who they are for one, and then how they determine the screening methods. Um, they are the nation's they're a board, they're a conglomeration or a collective of medical professionals who determine screening and intervention methods for a myriad of diseases. Um, so you may have a podiatrist or anesthesiologist determining what's the best, screening
Mhm.
method for prostate cancer, even though that's not their area of specialty. While they all come together to make a well-informed decision, they are the guiding, voice to healthcare policy. Because of recent conversations and discoveries about the way in which cancer metastasizes, and when I say metastasize, I mean grows in the body, a lot of people are recommending that you get screened prior to 50. If you're not at risk or have a family history um, of prostate cancer, they ask you to get screened at age 50. But if you do have it, um, have that history, they want you to get screened earlier. And there's new statistics that show that younger people are developing cancer at higher rates than older individuals. So this is the reason why it goes back to your point that young people need to know about it as well. I recently just turned 41, or I will turn 41 in December, and I recently had a colorectal exam. I'm not at risk for it at all, but I don't have to do it again until I turn 50. So these are things that young people and old people need to know. But
I
I want to
think that
return back to
second screening
yeah,
that you mentioned, the one with the
yeah,
finger, I've
yeah,
heard throughout my entire life many homophobic,
yes,
That's
many,
the one.
many jokes about that particular version
Yeah.
of it. I
yeah,
mean, my entire life, as long
Yeah.
as we mentioned in another episode, I loved watching comedians, right? And it'll be like the joke, like to use a punny statement, a pun, the butt of the joke would be a man being violated or the perception of a violation happening when it's a medical screening, right?
yeah.
So yeah, and then
That's the toxic masculinity I was pointing
yeah, I
to,
think
the
that
homophobia. Yeah. Yeah. Do you think that plays a role? Because the first one, you see, I can't even remember. It's the second one that's a part of pop culture, the butt of jokes in pop
and I hear
culture.
that the second one is actually more that it's a more precise one. I don't know, is
Yeah.
that my mother-in-law told me that. I don't know if that's accurate. That the one where it is engaging inside of a rectum and touching around, which is like what for years many people have been saying, don't let anybody touch you there, right? Or you're not a man, or you are a woman, right? Or you're the passive or whatever. Like it's a bunch of things, right? Versus the first one, which is a blood test.
Yes. And even with the blood test, depending on the generation and where the African American grew up, there's still hesitancy with that.
Yeah,
Um,
especially in
one
the South. Tuskegee experiments. Yeah.
And
Of
it's
and
not
everything.
so
irrational. And I really have a problem. See, look, we know, I hope most people know what the Tuskegee experiment is, but it is not irrational and completely, backwards when a person's like, hold up, let me be careful before you start, you know,
Mhm.
vaccinating me, touching me,
Yeah,
violating.
Raymond was busy during that because I'm sure you heard you got to deal with this, the Tuskegee syphilis, experiments, and then now fast forward, you got COVID. So you know how you
Narratives about that.
yeah. So yeah, that's interesting.
so
But
one of the things that I tell people to do to
Yes.
make sure that they understand the intersection between race, gender, and social location is to be aware of what has occurred in the country. So Dr. Harriet Washington wrote a great book called The Medical Apartheid that it kind of
mhm.
encapsulates all the inequities health-wise that have occurred
Write it
for
down.
African Americans. And a
Yeah,
lot of,
Harriet Washington, a Medical Apartheid is my go-to book, actually, Raymond.
Uh,
Yeah. Even
and
for
then
what you were talking about early, which is, the infant mortality rate amongst Black women, and also the high rates of Black women's death pre-post pregnancy or delivery. So yeah.
Clemson
Well, not
yeah,
just with preeclampsia, but
in general,
a whole bunch. Yeah, yeah. I mean, preeclampsia is one for sure, but the Black women's
mortality.
mortality rate, yeah, yes, it's maternal mortality rate. Yeah, it's higher than
and
some
then
in some developing countries.
I also encourage people to read the work of Dr. Joy DeGruy's post-traumatic slave disorder because that contextualizes everything that Dr. Washington talks about in her book. And
Yes,
so what
Dr.
I've
Joy
done
DeGroy. Yep, and
in,
I'll put
in
all these
my
links too in the description.
in the work that I do is I try to make sure that I summarize what the two books talk about and how to contextualize it for where those fears come from. So when we talk about masculinity, we talk about what Dr. Jordan Grew talked about when she spoke about slave patrols and how the white majority conceptualized the African brain and the way the African brain thinks is at a level that is Neanderthal, and to justify the atrocities in which, that were perpetuated among members of enslaved Africans. And so going back again to the point about the digital rectal exam and the prostate specific exam, oftentimes a lot of individuals will defer to the prostate specific and antigen test because it's less invasive. The digital rectal exam is more invasive and it causes uncomfortability for men who assume, white narratives of masculinity as a part of their identity. And through that assumption, it puts them at a disadvantage, thus puts them at higher mortality rates because of the way that they can conceptualize their manhood.
I
And
think
so this
religion
goes back to
too.
say it again.
I think religion too.
Yes.
Like the entanglement of whiteness, white supremacist Christian kind of, or Judeo-Christian or whatever. I think this idea of the worst thing you can be is somebody whose prostate or anus is penetrated or touched is something we need to really, really examine because it's
And
hurting the men.
Wow, Raymond. So what I heard is historical racism, the intersection of historical racism, cultural beliefs, medical literacy,
Mhm.
policy, because you talked about that task force, and
Mm,
religion,
Yeah.
yeah.
right? So I because I like the way you, you all reframe that, right? But Raymond, I love that because I can't just say, oh, this is, toxic masculinity. There's a context, there's a social historical context to where uh these these beliefs are coming from. These are real deep-seated fears. So you have to be careful blaming the victim,
And
right?
informed by historic, all those
Yeah.
things, those five things you just mentioned, informed. I really am very sensitive to when people are trying to be reductive about why Black people, men, women of all genders, are cautious, and or like I said, the word superstitious is used in a way that is very disparaging and dismissive of our intellectual,
Yeah,
spiritual,
these are real deep-seated memories
and
of the
informed. Yes,
medical
yes.
industrial complex, medical racism, as Raymond
And you
said.
guys are part of the solution.
Because Dr. Harriet Washington is an epidemiologist, correct? Am I
Mm.
right?
I
Oh,
think she,
she's genetic. Yeah, I think maybe she's a geneticist if I remember correctly.
I
But
want to know why prostate cancer came up since you're only 41. Where did
yeah,
why prostate cancer came up for you? And then a question that was asked earlier, I'm gonna sneak him in because I heard that she's ready to wrap it up, but
yeah, well, I was yeah, yeah. I was
she's
gonna
ready
say
to,
though, but I think too, Raymond, I wanted to be careful because I think that is a personal conversation between
yes,
your
yes,
doctor and your partner, right?
yes.
Because I think that because you did mention your age, I think a lot of people are going to explore it outside of you and who you represent, and I think that it does stop the stereotype of who's going in or who shouldn't be going in.
Mhm.
But I do want to wrap it up, so that was a segue. But I do want Mildred to ask you to, raise some fireside questions. Raymond, is this preventive? I was just thinking, I'm like, is it preventive, right? It's one thing to go in and say, go get checked. But is it preventive or is it all
I
genetics?
think so. Like, there's research that has been done that supports that we have African Americans or members of the African diaspora have a genetic predisposition towards prostate cancer, but there's not enough research to
Mm,
support that.
mm,
Oh,
However,
so that's a myth, possibly.
yes, yes.
Hmm.
So one of the things that brought me to do prostate cancer research is, so when I left my prior institution and went to Jackson State, I was, as you know, you have to do literature reviews and you have to know what you
mm,
know, and you got to defend what you got to, you
Yeah.
have to defend what you got to defend in order to get those three letters.
Know
So
what you know.
when I did my literature review, each time I went through the literature review, I counted how many times um, people discuss prostate cancer solely about Black people.
Mm,
In my literature review, I was only able to find 4 or 5 articles. Out of a
mm,
hundred and some articles I found, I only found four that specifically talked about those things that matters the most to Black men, which is,
mm,
do I have a good relationship with my doctor? Am I knowledgeable about this? Um, what type of health inequities will
mm,
stop me from being able to access clear health? And in those little 5 articles, I arrived at the conclusion I got to talk more about this, because when I looked at 1 in 4 Black men die from prostate cancer, and the American Cancer Society has all of these statistics on just Black men and the type
mm,
of cancers that they are most susceptible to, prostate cancer was right at the top. And so, what people fail to realize is that how prostate cancer occurs, there's a myriad of factors that can support it. It could be poor eating habits, poor exercise,
mm,
lack of knowledge about your genetic history, and it could just be one of those things that you may have been exposed to something that you weren't aware of. Because even when I go for my full physical, my doctor said, I'm gonna get you tested for tuberculosis, and I said, for what? I know people who got tuberculosis, so so. But he says, if I catch it now, I can treat it, and then you can move on with your life, because you can catch tuberculosis. I didn't know. As young as 10 and as old as 80. So those are the things that oftentimes does not happen. We don't have these conversations about how people get what and how people don't get what they get. Um,
mm,
and there's research that supports there's a correlation between CVD, which is, cerebral vascular disorder, which is heart disease. That's on the rise among African American men as well as women. Um, and in summation, so that I don't continue rambling on.
Oh, you're
No, that's good. No, I'm learning. I need to wake up. I'm like up here thinking like I'm in a
the
lecture.
the thing is, your best approach to preventative care is taking the first step to engage in the initial screening. Um,
Mm.
And if you do not have traditional insurances and things like that, there are still agencies that still engage in that type of work where they work with hospitals and clinics where they'll meet you where you are just to perform that, just as they typically do for high blood pressure and things. And it can still be done in the privacy of a little clinic, a mobile clinic. Um, so, but that's one of the things I'm trying to do with.
I guess you all this kind of look on my face or like I'm sitting in the lecture hall.
Mhm.
You know what you write in is because this is a lot of this information is not new to me because obviously I had the opportunity to read your work and hear you talk about it in sound bites, literally on social media, on Facebook in particular. Um, and I'm at an age where everybody's having these conversations, right, around different reproductive issues, or in this case, even like I said, I was just stunned at the way Lloyd Austin was treated, the Secretary of Defense. But Mildred, you have to be thinking this too. When at the onset of puberty, most girls now, on average, just 10 years ago, the onset of puberty was 12, Raymond, for girls. Now is declining. I think the average age is 10, right? For a whole lot of reasons. But you do realize, Dr. Adams, that a lot of girls are introduced to, say, gynecological exams, breast
Mhm.
awareness,
Yeah.
paps, you know what I'm saying?
I
Like
was.
pap
I was,
smears,
I was,
like
I remember the
they
screening.
want they start these conversations with us at the almost like I'm gonna say when I was growing up because I'm a little bit older than you all, but definitely by seventh or eighth grade. So
Yeah.
are boys not? I know boys aren't exposed to prostate exam conversations until they walk into that doctor's office at 35 and say, you're getting up there. You should probably
Yeah,
start thinking about this exam.
yeah.
Why?
Mm,
Is that not correlated? Am I thinking about this wrong? Should I not be comparing the
No,
organs and the genders?
no, no. I think again, we don't
great question. Because you're
have the
right.
conversations with young boys and older men in ways where it's safe for them to express them full selves. And from what I've done in my research, I've found that as long as you cultivate a safe space to have open and honest conversations with men, and as I said earlier, men listen to other men. And because they do, they are able to break down things that are not nuanced in the overarching culture in those safe spaces. And that's part of the reason why I say, the historical relevance of the Black church still holds true within the African American diaspora.
Yeah.
Always been a safe institution
And
for,
so is the partner, because you kept emphasizing how partnered men
yes,
are able to kind of like process this and make other choices, but the partner is a safe space, right? So
yes. So
maybe a partner.
that's the thing that I've felt has allowed for me to get the number of people that for my study is that I hone in on the partner and I talk to her or I talk to them about well, I need your husband to participate in this study and I'm going to deliver the following information. I could call the husband on the phone and say, and they look at me and say, what does this young man know about prostate cancer? I'm
Yeah.
62. But I talked to the partner and she says, you gonna listen to this 40-year-old boy come and tell you about what you need to be
Come
doing. And
on.
then you and
I
I are gonna go
love
there
that.
together. So, but that's what I'm talking about.
That's brilliant.
The church offers that space for the men to talk to young boys about the nuances of healthcare for the continued survival of their whole and strong selves. And so as long as you create that safe space for men to break that down, to talk about their penises, their anuses, and the way that prostate glands work in erections, and having those, conversations with them, it becomes a part, it's normalized for the young boys to say, well, if you can't maintain an erection, have you thought about going to see a doctor about your prostate gland? Because you know that's what helps control your erection. So that's part of the conversation that needs to happen. How are we building safe and open spaces for Black men to talk about these problems amongst each other? And I caught strays, as you know, Dr. V, when I tell people I don't do research on any other group other than Black Black men or Black women.
Mhm.
Well, we always hear, well, what about the whites? What about the Hispanics? What about the others? And my answer was and has always been, they have people for that. I'm just not one of those
I
people.
heard that.
We all
So
have different ministries.
yeah.
But
So
you know,
that's
too, I
that's the
love the
thing.
way, because Raymond, I heard you when you said 1 in 4 Black men will be diagnosed with prostate cancer. Do you
Mhm.
know, because I am so familiar with how you do things, and I do not use white people as my yardstick in research,
Mm.
right? I didn't even follow up and say, yeah, so what's the statistics for the that's not a comparison. It's not a comparison group. That's a part of white,
Logic.
supremacist science. So we have to be very careful when we start comparing, across racial and ethnic groups. But Raymond, I do have a question. So, for you, right? Tell me, like, I want to know, like, what does health and wellness look like for you in the academy? Because you just said you took strays. What does health and
Yeah.
wellness look like for you?
Oh, yeah.
Over time, I've learned
Mhm.
in higher education is that it was not built by us or for us.
Mm.
And so when you understand that you have to walk intentionally about your self-care. So, my computer goes off at 9 o'clock and I'm in the bed, and that could be because I'm getting older. So I also make sure that I'm always going to, as impassionate as I was when I was 20, I want to be impassioned about what I do as I become 90. So in order for that to happen, you have to understand.
I like that. Can you repeat that again? I needed to hear that.
That was good.
As impassioned as I was in my 20s, I want to be impassionate as I was in my 20s as I march towards the 90s. You know.
That's funny, Raymond, because I'm just trying to live to 105. You know why? Because I want my son to have to take care of me. Like, that's my goal. I want to live to 105, and my son, he's gonna have to take care of me.
I have a best friend who's 94. And yeah, it's fascinating. I'm
My
loving
aunt is 101. Well, 101 and a half now. She'll be 102 in September. Full
love that.
faculty.
Love it.
Go ahead,
But
Raymond.
that's what I do. To maintain my sense of connection to the institution and the people in which I serve. And so I've been more intentional now that I work in Morgan with the centers, because the centers here are funded in perpetuity by the state of Maryland. And because of that, we're able to actually engage community partners more intentionally. So as I stated earlier, I did something around fatherhood and maternal health with the Center for Urban Equity. And it's because of that experience, I saw how I lean into my knowledge about what prostate cancer looks like for fathers, and what does that mean for them as they traverse their care while maintaining their fatherhood to make sure that
Mm.
they're whole and strong. And I continue to say whole and strong because of the way in which I conceptualize ourself. You can still bring
Whole
your
and
whole self.
strong. Hmm.
Yes, you bring your whole self to your
Mm.
job, to your family, and to the people you interact with every day, and you maintain those strong ties because they're meaningful people, institutions, and interactions,
I love
and
that.
that's why you do what you do. So that's how I conceptualize the work I do in higher education. Yes, I write to publish, but I also write to meet the needs of the people, because I can publish in the Journal of Social Work Education about prostate cancer, but the people who need that information don't have time to pay for a subscription to read about it, let alone the funds. As someone who has experienced planned poverty during my doctoral education, I,
Mm.
I see the value of articles, but I also see the value in disseminating what those articles have shown to the people who really need it. So,
Hence
Mhm.
this podcast, right? And hence
yes.
this
Mhm.
work and taking your
Yep.
time to do this. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I want people to hear the voices of people like you are, Dr. Boveda and Dr. Adams. I think that what we're facing in academia is a lot more people are talking about, Black-centered research, right? African-centered research or research by Black people for Black people. But I don't think that is being disseminated in the same ways. But even more importantly, I don't think the academic community get to hear us talk about research. So it's not being heard in our voices yet. If you turn on TikTok, I said turn on TikTok. I just gave away my age. If you're watching TikTok or you're on Instagram or YouTube, you're gonna in these podcasts, that's what the kids are listening to. That's what young people, everybody under the age of 35 for the most part is on these devices, right? But um how often do you get to hear Black people's voices engage in research conversations, academic conversations, scientific conversations? Uh, Not much, not much. And so, yeah, this was definitely intentional. Raymond, I had a question for you.
Mhm.
um, that's what health and wellness looks like for you in the academy, getting good sleep and just staying
Yeah.
youthful. And
Yes.
Whole
as you
and
know,
strong. Whole and strong. I
whole
heard
and strong, showing up whole and strong. And I'm a student of comedy and subtle comedy in the old school ways of Dick Gregory, right? And others. But there is something that you say that cracks me up every time you put it in writing. I won't embarrass you because you can you can mention it if you want to, but I just die laughing. I don't care what time of the day it is, right? I don't care if I'm in my
Dr. Adams
pajamas
has an
or if I'm
excellent
like, right, or if I'm like
sense
in
of
a
humor.
nice, like, working outfit, professional outfit. Every time I see you say that word or you actually say it, I just crack up laughing. I'm like, this is the original trickster. But anyway, so good comedic um
Now I
line. If
want
you
to
want to
go
say it, you can say
introverted.
it, or you don't. Maybe it's between a joke between us, but it is hilarious. But with that said, I do think humor too is a part of
Yes.
uh
Repertoire of
your
skills.
spirituality. I think
Yeah.
it's a part of your health and wellness, right? Kind of not making other people laugh, but being showing up fully human, and humor is a part of the human
Definitely.
experience. So I appreciate that. Um, the other thing I wanted to ask you is, and Mildred and we ask everybody this question who's on the podcast, and we ask each other this question over and over again. So we're gonna ponder it, and our listening
Mm.
audience is asking themselves this question, journaling on it, because I do be giving out homework, so everybody has writing assignments or reflection assignments for their journal writing. For you, Raymond, what has daughtering taught you about health and wellness in your work? Daughtering. So either you watching your mothers or your mom, your grandparents, your aunts, your partner, your sisters, your play sisters, your god sisters, the women you work with. What has daughtering taught you about health and wellness and the work that you do?
Maybe the research participants. You mentioned their partners and their wives. Maybe daughters are showing up as well.
Well, I mean, so I guess my response is threefold. So I grew up in a matriarchal society.
Okay,
So
come on.
a lot of the decisions in which happen for men and for the Wallop country is by women. And so
Is it matrilineal?
matriarchal, yes, matriarchal, is, very matriarchal. So, and I grew up with I grew up with a lot of women, and I grew up with a lot of sense of knowing what it takes to maintain a family. And I've always seen women in such a strong and pivotal roles. That's part of the reason why I always incorporate what I'm doing now in my research is women, particularly Black women. And so I've seen how women have raised 10 children, which is uh, something. 10 children on, their limited knowledge about, what it takes to raise a family, but they somehow did it. And I've seen the way in which the women who've interacted with me in the academy have brought me in and educated me about, well, you shouldn't say that, or you shouldn't do that, or, make sure that, I'm just whole, if I'm not supportive, I'm always thankful to Dr. Cynthia Tyson for the way in which she kind of just wrapped me up in arms and
Mhm.
kind of like just talks to me, I could pick up the phone and call and say, these people over here, and did give me this and I've done all this. She said, well, that may be true, but let's look at it this way. But that's what I mean when
Yeah.
people ask me
Yeah.
about mothering,
Mother and
or
academy.
daughtering, I'm
Mhm.
hopeful that when the opportunity presents myself for me to have a daughter, I won't be concerned about not knowing about, the menstrual cycle or when she has her first period. I won't freak out because I just have women around me, like, you know,
Mhm.
she's having this issue. Can you come by the house and help me understand what I need to do? That's for me has always been a central blessing in my life is that I've always had Black women around me who have always protected me and safeguarded me from things that I have not been readily aware of. I hope
That
that
was
answers
nice.
your question.
Yes, it did. You took
Yeah.
us back. That was like a Sankofa, moment, by the way. That was really beautiful. I hope you do, Raymond, get a chance to go back and listen to some of our other conversations. We have one that's not on the podcast, it's actually on YouTube Live. Really, really interesting because it was no time to like pause and all that stuff. We having a whole 10-minute conversation before, like, are we recording? Are we on? Are we live? Right? So just having fun. So Raymond, I'm glad you can be here. And at this moment, this is when we do our check-in. So
Mhm.
Raymond, thank you for sharing your daughtering experience with us and what you get out of daughtering and mothering across the academy as a Black man, as an African person. And so, Mildred, I know you were wondering. For those of you who are in your car or listening instead of on YouTube, I have to have a moment of flex. So my goal, Dr. Adams, was to actually complete 15 miles of running in the month of May. I'm an overachiever. I'm the middle child. So I actually completed 30 plus miles in the month of May. And the goal was to actually to bring awareness to mental health amongst Black women and girls. In particular, as a part of the Still I Run campaign, I wanted to bring awareness to not only mental health, but Black women and girls and other girls and women of color's right to safe spaces to run and to be outdoors. So y'all, I know this is actually what I do during the academic year too. I like wear my medals to class, to the lectures. So here's my medal. Can you all see that? It's absolutely
Mhm.
I
beautiful.
love it.
So
It is
this is
beautiful.
this is the Still I Run running streak for mental health, in honor of Mental Health Month, which was last month, and as you know, we talked about today. This month now is men's mental health month, right? But so here's my medal, just as evidence, as proof that I did complete actually more than 30 miles. I reached my running streak. Mildred, any good news about your mental health journey?
My fitness, wellness, mental, all of that. Good news. Radical honesty is been
Yes.
good news. Radical honesty with myself is something that has come out of has been an outcome of this series of conversations and this journey. I have not been making the 10,000 steps. My mother-in-law is in town. She's cooking, right? I haven't cooked. One of my personal goals was to cook 5 times a week. I haven't been cooking five times a week, but I have been eating at home, right? Because somebody is cooking for me, which
That's
is
good.
beautiful, and I'm grateful to have my
Mhm.
mother-in-law in town. But something that's come out of all of these conversations is the need to be radically honest with myself, in terms
Mm.
of why am I not doing the 10,000 steps, or why has meditation been especially challenging in a week where I had to do a lot of travel, right? So that's my update, and I love the fact that we're doing this, and like I have to. I have to be honest, when we have these conversations and you come in with that amazing medal and I'm super, super excited to see it. And you're meeting you're meeting the goals and I am going a different path, right? And what's the being radically honest about it. But yeah, I'm on it. I'm working
Thank
on it.
you, Mildred. Thank you for your radical honesty. So I think that that's important. In fact, let's journal on two things because I thought what you just said was very, very important for all of us. So the two journal reflections for today, one comes from Dr. Adams, and it's on spirituality, centering spirituality. So the question for our journal reflections for today is, how do you center spirituality in your relationships with work or labor? How
Mm,
does spirituality show up? And just be radically honest. It may not for some people. Some people separate the two, right? Two. So one, how does spirituality show up in your work, in your labor? Two, radical honesty. Radical honesty. Define for yourself, what does radical honesty look like in your life? What does radical honesty look like in your life? So that's our journaling prompt. That's two. What I do want to say, Mildred, radical compassion.
I love that. Which is the gentleness, which I've been on.
Gentleness, radical compassion. I teach this to my clients. And let me tell you something, Mildred.
Yes.
First of all, you are eating at home. Two, you
Yeah,
do have
yeah.
a mother-in-law who's cooking for the family, which means you get to rest and enjoy that
Yes.
time with your
Yes.
family and with your food.
Yes.
Third, when we first started out, I said, Mildred, I don't know about 10,000 steps, right? And you was like, no, I
Mhm.
do that anyway. I do that in my sleep. And I said, well, maybe, just make
Yes,
it less so you can reach the goal. Now,
you
keep in
did.
mind, radical honesty. I knew that I had to do meet 10, 30 miles in the
You
month of
had an
May. But
event.
what did I do? I
Mm,
lowered it, remember, for myself. So I lowered it to 15 miles. So that way I'm not beating myself up. It's not that I was lowering my standards for myself, but I knew that this moment can come where I didn't want to have to say, I failed at this, or I did not achieve this, or I feel bad. You see what I'm saying? And
yeah,
then guess what? I exceeded my expectations for
I love it.
myself while also giving back to my community. So I think that we have to be careful in the language. In the language, because this whole project is about compassion, compassion, compassion. Raymond
Yes.
just talked about his compassion for his research participants, right? Raymond talked about how Black men can have compassion for the women in their lives, right? And Raymond talked about his own compassion for himself as a researcher across different institutions. And I think we should normalize compassion. It's not
Absolutely.
about meeting or exceeding goals. It's about naming our goals for ourselves, and we'll decide how we reach them or how we will reach them. Okay, so radical compassion alongside radical honesty.
I love
With that said, I do want to wrap up, and I want to
it.
thank you again, Raymond. Congratulations at being at Morgan State. I wish I could be one of your students. You're gonna make me laugh when we end this podcast, this
Yes.
episode, field note, because you know what the word is I'm talking about. And I, and I want
Yes.
to thank Dr. Mildred Boveda again because we had a pact and we had an agreement, a part of our sisterhood pact, our daughtering, mothering pact was that if I had to use a metaphor, an analogy,
Mm-hmm.
on that plane,
Yes.
that plane is going down. I've learned through hard work and self-awareness and reflection, as well as radical compassion for self, how to put on my mask so that I can give my sister Mildred a mask, right? Two, to put on her mask. So I want to thank you, Mildred, for allowing me to help you put on your mask while we help save ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you so much. And thank you again, Dr. Adams. This was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
And
you
to the
both.
viewers.